have enough to eat, okay? Awesome. Thanks for coming up. Good morning, those brave drivers out there. I'm glad you were here. I'm glad you all got here safely. Thanks for being here today, and thanks for those of you that scooted up a little bit. It helps. It helps to not have everyone in the back of the room. It's great. And everyone who's online also, I'm sure we have more of you this morning, so thank you for tuning in. I've been thinking about fasting a lot this week. I've had some conversations about it even. I think it's such an interesting process that Jesus, in the Bible story, fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and those 40 days in this Bible story are why we celebrate 40 days of Lent. It's a similar time, and we fast for our 40 days of Lent kind of in symbolic solidarity with Jesus and the way that Jesus fasted for those 40 days. And I wanted to ask, are there people in here who are doing a Lenten fast this year? Is there anybody doing that? Okay, a couple of us, not many. Interesting. It's very interesting. There's a variety of different traditions as far as Lenten fasting goes. Lenten fasting has a very long tradition in the church. In fact, it comes with one of my favorite church history stories ever, and I couldn't preach about fasting this morning without telling you the story of the affair of the sausages. Have we heard this one? Oh, it's one of my favorite church history stories. I nerd out about this one all the time, and I love to tell it to the youth. But it's the story of the beginning of the Swiss Protestant Reformation. What happened was, only a few short years after Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church, down in Switzerland, something was brewing. And in the city of Zurich, there was a priest named Ulrich Zwingli, and he got together with the people from this printing press and another priest, and there were other people from the community to form a protest because the Pope had said something kind of crazy. The Pope had said that it was mandatory. No one was allowed to eat meat during Lent. It was a mandatory Lenten fast from meat. We have some Germans in here, right? Maybe some Swiss Germans too. How would you feel about that? Yeah, that's how they felt about it, but more. They were not okay with being forced into this feast. So there was this printing press, this printing shop, and this shop did all of the printing for the entirety of the Swiss government. And they got together, all of their people, and they invited Zwingli, and then they invited other people from other trades, and they got together, and the story varies a little bit on how it goes, but what happened is Zwingli definitely blessed some meat, and then they ate it. Now, some people will tell the story and say this was a huge feast, that it was like plates and plates of meat donated by a farmer. Another version of the story I've read said it was 2 links of sausage cut up into really small pieces. But they made sure that the story got out. They made sure that everyone knew that they had eaten meat in defiance against the word of the church, of the entire Roman Empire, this rule that you couldn't eat meat during Lent. They protested by eating sausage, and it ended up sparking the whole Swiss Protestant Reformation. It was what led to Zwingli getting excommunicated from the church. All came down to forced Lenten fasting. Now, luckily, we don't have that kind of rule today, because as we said, I also have Swiss German roots, and I want my sausage. But luckily, we don't have to deal with any of those rules today, but there are still traditions of Lenten fasting around us. I've participated in it a little bit in the past. One of the favorites always seems to be fasting from chocolate. That's one I hear a lot. Fasting from coffee is another one, or caffeine is another one that I hear a lot. And I've practiced fasting in a variety of settings during my life. I haven't done it as much recently, but there have been times, like with the high school youth here, we've done the 30-hour famine where you fast for 30 hours in solidarity with people in hunger around the world. I've fasted a little bit growing up. I was taught that what you do when you fast is when you feel you don't eat, and then when you feel hungry, you, instead of eating, you just remind yourself to say a prayer, to think on a thought, to focus on God, to listen in that moment. The hunger pangs are a reminder. And in ways I've found a lot of value in that, but there are also times when I question it. In fact, I currently don't do a Lenten fast because the idea, I think, of Lenten fasting is, well, you give up something that is somehow inhibiting you from hearing what God is trying to say to you. so that you can listen better. And I'm like, why would I do that for 40 days and then stop? Like, why would I put something back into my life after 40 days that was stopping me from interacting with God in some way? So I don't really do that. And then the other thing, and this is just with hunger fasting that I've discovered, not eating can make you kind of cranky. Anybody else? In fact, you can go online, first of all, and you can read like article after article about how you shouldn't make big decisions when you haven't eaten. This is a thing, and it's great advice. Don't do it. In fact, no one is immune to this. Even Jesus, it's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. Jesus walks up to a fig tree looking for fruit, and there wasn't any on the tree, and then he curses the tree and it dies. I call that story Hangry Jesus. Because I don't have a better explanation for what's going on there. Even Jesus was susceptible. We can get hungry. We get not ourselves. We need that nourishment. And this is why I think it's really interesting in this Bible story that Jesus goes out in the wilderness and fasts for 40 days. And it says he was famished. And then guess who shows up? Then Satan shows up, the tempter, to try to tempt Jesus when he was at his weakest point. I think that's super interesting because obviously it failed. It didn't work. Jesus didn't give in. But and not for Satan's lack of trying. He started out with the real kicker is how about you make some bread? But I think it's interesting because fasting can be looked at from a couple of different ways, a couple of different perspectives that, while they may seem similar, are very different. On one hand, you could see it as the spiritual practice of depriving yourself of something that you need, of giving up something that you have to have that's a deprivation. There are lots of religions, not just Christianity, that practice in that kind of way of depriving yourself of something, whether it's food, whether it's comfort items, all sorts of things like that. But then there's another way that you can look at fasting, which is not that you're giving up something that you have to have, something that you need, but instead you are tapping in to an endless supply that's already available to you, right? Instead of giving up something that you know you need all of it, so I need food and now I don't have food, instead you could look at it as like, I don't need the strength from food because I have all the strength I need. It's already been given to me. And that's one of the ways I was taught to fast, was to focus on, okay, when that strength goes away from food, trust in the strength of God. I think those two different perspectives, like I said, they can sound really similar, but they're really crucially different because we have a difference there between a perspective of scarcity and a perspective of abundance. And those can be kind of tricky. I remember when Becky and I were first dating, it was one of the things that we had to work on the most together because our families, of course, when we talk scarcity and abundance, we talk about money a lot. Our families kind of did things a little bit differently growing up. My family wasn't necessarily poor. I would never describe myself as poor growing up because we always had everything that we needed. But the way I always tell it is I remember it being a big deal when I needed basketball shoes. Like when basketball season came, especially one year where the team chose these team shoes and they were kind of expensive. And I remember it being a really big deal that I got those basketball shoes. But we weren't poor. I had everything I needed. We always had food on the table. We even went on a vacation basically every summer. But I remember things like that. Then the first time I went and I visited Becky's family at their house, I walked in and I realized that everybody had the newest iPhone, first of all. And I remember going into the pantry and I remember seeing Mountain Dew and Reese's and Oreos, all these name brand snacks that would have never had in my house. And I was like, oh man, they've got it. They've got it figured out here. They have plenty. And then I remember talking to Becky and she would just tell me about how poor they were growing up. And it was this crazy thing where we were like, whoa. And we even talked about our parents, how much money they made, and we realized her parent actually made a decent bit more money than mine did. But we had come into our relationship with two completely different perspectives, not just on how we looked at money, but it shaped how we looked at the world for a while. It was like, are we working from a place of like, okay, we have lots of money, but we spend it on all sorts of things, and now we feel like we never have enough? Or was it we always have everything we need, which is the place I grew up in? And it was part of earlier in our relationship, not just with money, with a lot of things. We had to sort that out together and figure out how do we get on the same page and how we're going to look at the world. But scarcity and abundance doesn't just apply to money. It applies to a lot of things. I mean, in our first Bible story, it's the difference between why can't I eat from this tree versus look at all these trees we have to eat from, right? It's a tale as old as time. But it goes in other places too. We can talk about food. There's a direct correlation between kids and adults with food insecurities and their levels of obesity. It's almost like from a very young age, whether it's because there's not enough food available or because it's not nutrient-dense food, people learn, eat as much as you can whenever you get it. And then even when they're grown, even when they're not really food insecure anymore, those kind of habits, those kind of mindsets can still persist. It's something that carries on. So I've been thinking about this week, and I've been thinking about that with fasting. And I've been wondering, what about us at St. Andrew? I wonder, doing a little self-checkup. How are we doing? Are we operating out of an abundance mindset, or are we operating out of a scarcity mindset? Because obviously, things can feel a little bit scarce right now. We're in a transition period here. I mean, if I'll speak for the staff members, we can't wait for Pastor Lori to come in just a little over 1 week. We're so excited for that. But we've been almost 2 months now without a lead pastor. And all sorts of things have changed over the last 2-3 years. We've lost people. We've had staff members move on. We've had a lot of change, and it can get to feel really scarce. What can happen in the midst of that? This is what I get worried about. What can happen in the midst of that is when things start to feel scarce, when we start to get in that mindset, that is the perfect place for fear and temptation to jump in. That is the perfect place for us to start getting worried about, okay, wait a second, maybe we don't have enough, maybe we need to cling on tight, maybe we need to hold on and hold out, and we get a little rigid, and we get a little scared, because that's what happens when you get stuck in a scarcity kind of mindset. I've seen this pattern in churches, a lot of churches, over the last couple decades. It's been happening a lot, where churches of people get older and they start to get a little scared that their way of doing things is dying, and they start to hold on a little tighter out of this sense of fear, right, out of this anxiety that comes with it, and they go, wait, no, we have to hold on to that, and they get rigid and they get stiff. And then what happens ultimately is that it dwindles and it dwindles and it dwindles. Now, it's not the only way, though. I remember this one story. My family planted a church in Eastern Oregon when I was in middle school, and it grew into a pretty viable congregation for a number of years. And while I was actually in college, the church, we lost our lease. The building we were renting said you can't be there anymore. We didn't know where we were going to go. But there was a Methodist church in town that had dwindled down to probably 15, 20 members left at that point. And they had a big youth room, and they were like, we don't remember the last time we had a kid in our youth room and this and that. And they did something crazy. They just gave their building. They gave the whole building away for $1 and said, all right, new church, come in here. Look at all these resources. Come do it. You don't have to do it our way. We just want this place. This place is for God. We want kids in our youth room again. They said, come on in. And they just gave this beautifully generous gift out of a place when they could have been thinking in the most scarce mindset possible. They found a place of abundance from which they could be incredibly generous. In all of this, what I can see is I can see St. Andrew feeling like we're in a time of fasting right now, right? This transitional period, not just from Pastor Mark to when Pastor Lori is going to join us here soon, but probably much longer than that. This whole period might feel like a period of fasting. It might feel like, man, we're not taking in, or we're not getting as much as we thought we were used to, or maybe we're intentionally not doing some things, and that can leave that kind of fasting feeling. But what I'm reminded of is something that Pastor Mark said in several of his last meetings at St. Andrew. He said it to different groups, to council, to staff. It was like almost a mantra to him. He said, focus, focus, focus. You can hear it in his voice, right? Focus, focus, focus. And as I think about that, the way I have thought about it up until about this week was like, that's really practical advice. That's good. Like, we're down a little bit of staff right now. Our congregation looks a little different after the pandemic. Yeah, we're going to have to focus on some core things. But I'm realizing, this isn't just practical. He's being prophetic. He was being prophetic with those words. To focus, focus, focus. That's why we fast, right? That's the point of the spiritual practice, is to focus ourselves. So if this is a season of fasting for St. Andrew, what can we focus on? We can focus in on what are the core things? What are the essential things? What is God calling us to? It was interesting. I had a conversation with India yesterday as we were going through what kind of backup plans we might need in case we got dumped with more snow tonight and nobody could come in. One of the questions was, okay, what if Terry couldn't make it from East Portland and he can't preside over communion? What do we do? Well, it's like, okay, it's not, while communion is essential, it's not actually essential that we do communion every single week, right? We could survive if we miss 1 week communion. We could figure that out. Those types of conversations where it's like, what is actually essential? What are the core? You go back, our confirmation students have been great about this too. I remember my first year here, the first class of confirmants, Pat Christensen was talking to them about communion. They were talking about presiding over communion, blessing the elements, and they started to ask questions like, well, how long does it last? Like, could someone do it via a video? Does it have to be live video, or could it be pre-recorded? And what was hilarious about it is then a year later, we were in a pandemic, and people were asking those exact same questions. It's these questions, they're starting to focus, right? What they're doing is they're starting to get in on like, okay, what's this actually about? What's actually going on here? What's actually important? Focus, focus, focus. So as we go through this season together, as a church, as we sort out what is next, who's going to be with us, who's going to lead us there, all of these big questions, as things inevitably change, focus, focus, focus. Let's work together. Let's keep our minds centered on making sure that we are coming from not a place of scarcity and fear, but rather a place of abundance and trust and gratitude in all that God has provided for us already and where God is taking us going forward. Focus, focus.